Um, Dr. Ellen Bialystok is a distinguished research professor of psychology at York University and associate scientist at the Rotman Research Institute of Baycrest. She's an officer of the Order of Canada and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Her research uses behavioral and neuroimaging methods to examine the effect of bilingualism on cognitive processes across the lifespan. Her discoveries include the identification of differences in the development of cognitive and language abilities for bilingual children, the use of different brain networks by monolingual and bilingual young adults performing cognitive tasks, and the postponement of symptoms of dementia in bilingual older adults. Her current studies are investigating the effects of bilingual education on children's development and the cognitive and brain consequences of bilingualism in older adults. Among her many awards are the Killiam Prize for the Social Sciences 2010, York University President's Research Award 2009, and the Donald T. Stuss Award for Research Excellence at the Baycrest Geriatric Center 2005. In 2017, she was granted an honorary doctorate from the University of Oslo for her contributions to research. Dr. Bialystok, we're honored to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this interesting meeting. It's different from the kinds of meetings I usually attend, so I'm especially looking forward to hearing your comments and your reactions to my work. So why would this even be a question? Why would anybody think that bilingualism would have any effect on minds or brains? The reason turns out to be something very surprising about the way brains are designed. Human brains are designed. Now, if I were going to build a human brain that could manage two languages, I would put in a switch. I would have sort of two sections of the brain and a switch that moved between them. That way there would be no confusion. But that's not what happens. The bilingual mind has both languages always active all the time. There is no switch. And this means there's constantly potential conflict. Both languages are always bumping up against each other. And yet we know that bilinguals very rarely make mistakes. They don't accidentally go to the wrong language when they're having a conversation. How do they do this? So our best guess about how they do this is that they use a part of the brain whose particular job it is to select a target when there's conflict. And this is part of the attention network. It's part of a domain general cognitive function that we have. And we know where it is. It's in the front part of the brain. So the idea is that if bilinguals are using this general attention system for language management, the same system they use for managing any conflict, then there's a few things we will expect. One is they should just be better at managing conflict. So if we give these simple conflict tasks to monolingual and bilinguals, bilinguals should be better at them. And that's exactly what we find, especially for children and older adults. And I'm talking about conflict that has nothing to do with language. And I'll show you some examples. Second, because we know that this system is in a particular part of the brain that connects to other known parts of the brain, using that system all the time for managing language should change some of the structure and connections of that system to other systems. And we find that. And the third consequence is that we find what I will explain in a moment is cognitive reserve in older age. And all of these consequences come from the simple fact that both languages are always active in a bilingual mind, and something has to manage attention, or bilinguals will just always be pouring out the wrong language. Now, I've been talking about bilingualism and bilinguals, but bilinguals are not one thing. And in research now on bilingualism, there's a lot of very sophisticated studies that are showing all the important ways that bilingual experience differs across different contexts, different types of language use situations, and that these differences actually have an effect on all of the results I'm going to show you. So using two languages in different ways, in different contexts, with different kinds of people, where your experiences with these languages started at different ages and you use them to different degrees with different relative proficiencies, it all matters. So this is incredibly complex research, complex concepts, because these are multidimensional descriptions of an experience, and all of those factors impact what we're measuring. So I want to tell you about bilingualism here in Toronto in the context where I do my research. So here we have many different languages spoken. Most bilinguals in Toronto are middle socioeconomic status. They're not particularly at risk or impoverished. They're not particularly socially isolated. There are many heritage languages, and the whole society is officially multicultural. Now you can see that that's quite different from the US, and it's also very different from many other countries. And as I say, the context matters. So here's some statistics in Toronto where I do my research. There's just under 6 million people. 63% of households do not use English or French. We have to say that because that's in the official census. 63, almost 2/3 of the households do not use an official language as the primary language of the home. And of those non-English, non-French languages, there are 224 different languages mentioned on the census form. So that's bilingualism here. It's highly diverse, integrated into the community, and there is no confound with social class, education. These things are all perfectly distributed. So that's who I'm talking about. Well, the main thing I want to talk about today is cognitive reserve. As we age, we lose brain volume and we lose cognitive ability. This is healthy, normal aging. It's inevitable, and there's nothing we can do about it. So this little graph shows a hypothetical relation over age for brain structure shown in blue and cognitive levels shown in green. They both decline. It's natural, it's normal, and they tend to decline in a correlated manner. So you could take any level of one and predict the other. Someone has lost this amount of brain volume, you would expect their cognitive level to be similarly disrupted. That's typical aging. Cognitive reserve is the idea that as the inevitable reduction in brain volume proceeds, there is no concomitant reduction in cognitive level. So cognitive reserve is the preservation of cognitive ability despite deterioration in brain structure. So that's not bad, right? If we can't do anything about the inevitable decline of our brain, what we really want is to be able to maintain cognitive function. And that's why you hear about all these things that we need to be doing. All of these activities produce cognitive reserve, exercise, education, music, et cetera, and you hear this all the time. Do these things to keep your cognitive level up. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is another such thing, which is bilingualism. Another factor that I will try to persuade you has the effect of producing cognitive reserve and keeping the green line up despite the decline in the blue line. And what this means is that the brain behavior relations, these are the brain behavior relations, are different for monolinguals and bilinguals. That's the argument. And I'm going to show you evidence looking at healthy aging, the onset of dementia, and the progression of dementia. I'm going to frame all of the argument, all of the evidence I'm going to show you around this, this diagram, which I find very helpful. It was proposed by Jakob Stern, who really is the main person in cognitive reserve. And he created this diagram to explain the relation between these moving parts. So let me explain the diagram. On the x-axis, you have increasing neuropathology. And you can think about that in terms of loss of, atrophy of brain matter, accumulation of Alzheimer's disease pathology. Anything that compromises the brain increases along this x-axis. So as we move to the right here, we have poorer brains. On the y-axis, we have some kind of cognitive score. So these are the same two factors that I showed you in the previous slide for cognitive reserve, but instead of plotting them together, we've now made each of them a separate axis. So now we can look at the relation between brain and cognition. So his argument that a low reserve individual, which let's say is a typical individual, has some kind of brain structure, some kind of cognitive level, and as aging takes place and brain structure inevitably declines, they plod along and they can maintain whatever they're doing at some level until they can't. And then we start to see cognitive decline because this is increasing, pathology is increasing. And then at some point, they'll cross this threshold. And the threshold is the clinical level below which they are diagnosed with some kind of cognitive impairment, mild cognitive impairment, dementia, whatever. That's typical. Now, if we take a high reserve individual, they start with a higher cognitive score, same brain score, and they're able to maintain that cognitive performance for longer. But then cognitive level declines here as well and eventually crosses the threshold. That's the diagram, and I'm going to use it to demonstrate 4 specific predictions from the cognitive reserve framework for bilinguals. The first one, with healthy aging, bilinguals will have higher cognitive level than monolinguals. That's the difference here. We're talking about healthy aging, so we're still, pretty good brains, and we're only comparing cognitive scores. So how do monolinguals and bilinguals compare on some kinds of cognitive tests? And I'll just say these have to be tests that include conflict, because that's what they're using their brains for in bilingual language management. All right, here is one study. There's been many studies done using various kinds of conflict tasks, and typically the bilinguals do these tasks better. Here's one example. A very common task in this literature is the Stroop task. In the Stroop task, you are shown word names printed in colored ink. And your task is Name the color of the ink. Don't read the word. Name the color of the ink. And because you can't help reading the word, it's much easier to say red when the word is red than it is to say red when the word is green. So these two items have the same answer, red, but this one has no conflict. It's easy. This is the conflict item. So we've given this to monolinguals and bilinguals. We've given it to middle-aged people, young adults, and older adults. And this is a typical data set. What I'm plotting here is how much more time they need to say red for this hard item than for this easy item. Now, on all of these graphs I'm going to show you, monolinguals are in red and bilinguals are in blue. In this case, the solid bars are young adults, the hashed bars are older adults. And what I'm plotting is how much more time they need. And what you can see is that for both younger and older adults, monolinguals need more time. So this item, to say red when the word is green, is more conflicting, confusing, more interfering for monolinguals. And I would argue that that's because they are less efficient at dealing with that kind of conflict. So that's the first prediction, healthy aging, just looking at cognitive level. So there's the graph again. The second prediction is this time we're going to take a similar cognitive level, all right? The first prediction compared cognitive level. Now we're going to say, okay, just hold cognitive level constant. Just pick a cognitive level. And
data
sorry? Sorry. And if we hold cognitive level constant, then what this graph shows you is that for the same cognitive level, the high reserve group is further out along the neural pathology line. So this means that despite performing to the same level, the high reserve group, which I'm going to argue are the bilinguals, are doing it with a more compromised brain. What is the evidence for that prediction? In this case, we looked at brain, gray matter volume, how big their brains are. So we're going to take studies that control older adults for cognitive level and just measure their brain volume to see who has a better brain. And there are a bunch of studies that have done this, and the results are mixed. So here's what you get. There are a couple of studies out of this lab in Italy by Bialystok and his group that show the bilinguals have better brains, more gray matter volume. There's a couple more studies, Canada and the US, that say actually we held cognition level constant, measured their brains, and they were the same. And finally, we recently did a study in my lab where we also measured cognitive level and then looked at their brains. And now we found the monolinguals had way better brains. And I just put it up to show you that it's a very big difference. So on the x-axis here, the further right you go, the more brain volume they have. And here, monolinguals in red, bilinguals in blue. It's not ambiguous. The monolinguals have better brains. What's going on? How can the essentially same study produce three completely different results? Well, let's look a little deeper. How old were these older adults? In the first set of studies, they're around 60 years old. In the second set of studies, they're around 67 years old on average. I took the actual statistical averages. And in our recent study, they were 75 years old. So there's a pattern here. And what's happening is that despite having similar cognitive scores matched between groups, as age increases, the difference in gray matter volume shrinks and then reverses. So there's an increasing brain disparity with age for cognitively normal individuals. These are all cognitively normal individuals. Well, that's kind of hard to understand. So let's take those data points and just look at them separately in terms of age. So on this graph, the y-axis will be some kind of a level, and the x-axis is age. And I'm only plotting the ages we've been looking at from 60 to 75. So these are the actual data. But first, let's say hypothetically, because I know that in every one of these studies, all the participants were matched for cognitive level. So they're all cognitively equivalent at any age. Again, monolinguals in red, bilinguals in blue, they're cognitively equivalent. Now, what about their brains? Here's the line for those data I showed you for monolinguals. Their brain level starts here and it declines with age, as we expect. And again, remember that first graph I showed you for typical aging. Here is the data for bilinguals. Now notice what happens. For 60-year-olds, the bilinguals have actually more gray matter volume than monolinguals. 60 is kind of the cusp of older age. And with aging, brain atrophy will begin for both groups. At this point, not too far into aging, around 65 here, the lines cross and the brain volume is equivalent. But because the blue line is steeper, if we go out further, the difference has reversed, but remember, they're all cognitively equivalent. So the blue brains, the bilingual brains, the high reserve brains, have lost more gray matter, but perform to the same level. Now that's exactly the picture that we have here that I showed you earlier. Cognitive level remains the same, but the high reserve group maintains that cognitive level despite a very significant drop in brain structure. So that explains that mystery, but it raises a very troubling problem. Why does the bilingual line for brain volume drop so much more than the monolingual line? Do bilinguals just have poor brain structure? Does bilingualism lead to more rapid decline in brain structure? Well, we decided that the way to look at that question is kind of odd. This was a crazy idea I had in the shower one day. I thought the only thing that makes sense here is that the bilinguals are able to make use of their compromised brains in a way that monolinguals aren't. And if we could somehow put those bilingual brains in a monolingual head, they wouldn't do very well. Well, why don't those monolinguals show up in our studies? Because all of these studies with older adults only examine or use as participants people who are experiencing healthy aging. If there's any kind of clinical impairment or cognitive decline, they're not eligible for this study. So by matching all of the participants on cognitive level, what happens inevitably is the brain structure moves around. So here's the question I had. What if we could somehow figure out how to put those bilingual brains those not very good bilingual brains into a monolingual head, how would the monolinguals do? So we did it using a matching technique. We took the bilinguals from the study I just showed you, and we went to a database called ADNI, where there are thousands of brain images uploaded with all kinds of cognitive scores and so forth. And we picked up a very carefully matched sample, 1-to-1. For every bilingual, we found a monolingual in that database who was the same age, same sex, had the same amount of education, and crucially, had brain specs that were the same. So we found a monolingual with the same brain specs, okay? And so now we can ask the question, how would a monolingual do with that exact brain? Well, we know that 100% of the bilinguals in our sample were cognitively normal. We know that for lots of reasons. We know it because it was a criterion for participating in the experiment, but we also know it because we gave them a lot of cognitive tests and they were matched with monolinguals. So 100% of the bilinguals in our sample with these not very good brains were cognitively normal. What about the matched monolingual group with the same brains and the same values on these other factors? They did not do as well. And 41% of the monolinguals matched in this way had been diagnosed with a clinical cognitive impairment. So same brain, same background, but more cognitive impairment. The third specific prediction is now, instead of matching on cognitive level, we're going to move down the line, down the cognitive line, and take patients and match them for their clinical level. So cognitive level has declined to the point that it's at this threshold. And so these are now all patients who have been diagnosed with a cognitive impairment. And the prediction is, as we saw before, if we're at the same level, cognitive clinical level, what we expect is that the bilinguals will still have more neuropathology than the monolinguals at that level. Well, the first study we did on this, very simple study, we just looked at patient records in the hospital to see how old patients were when they were diagnosed with dementia. And we published that first study in 2007. And again, bilinguals are in blue, but now I'm plotting how old they were. So higher blue lines mean they were older. This is our first study. And as you can see, this has been repeated around the world in many, many labs and many studies. Bilinguals are typically almost always older when they're diagnosed with dementia. But now very few of these studies address the question I just raised because they don't include an evaluation of the brain. So our prediction then is for similar clinical levels, the bilinguals should have more neuropathology, poorer brains. We looked at this in a study where we took monolingual and bilingual Alzheimer's patients and matched them completely on age, cognitive level, clinical score, everything we could manage. And we had CT scans of their brains. So the prediction here is that the bilinguals will have more pathology. They're matched on clinical observable measures. Do the bilinguals have more pathology? Well, the first thing we look at is overall brain atrophy. Remember, they're the same chronological age. So what we're doing is plotting atrophy. Higher bars mean more atrophy, and monolinguals and bilinguals are exactly the same. Their brains are kind of shrinking at the same rate in the global general atrophy. Now, Alzheimer's disease begins in the medial temporal lobe around the hippocampus, and the accumulation of Alzheimer's pathology, plaques and tangles, all the beta amyloid and all that stuff, accumulates first in the medial temporal lobe, which shows up on a CT scan as atrophy. So let's now just look at atrophy in the hippocampus, in the medial temporal lobe. And here, and it's these regions here, the bilinguals have vastly more, it isn't even close, vastly more atrophy. That is, the bilinguals have far more disease than the monolinguals, but clinically, they present at the same level. This is, this is a slight detour, but I'll try to go through it quickly. I'm asked all the time if bilinguals develop Alzheimer's later and have more disease when they show symptoms and so on. Would it be the case that there's less Alzheimer's disease in bilingual populations? And there have been a couple of studies that look at that, but it's an odd question because nobody has ever said that bilingualism prevents Alzheimer's disease, only that it postpones it. So the studies that look at incidence in a healthy population have very mixed results. But what if we raised the stakes and said, you know, in any particular study, you only have so many patients, you have only so many incidents. What if we, instead of looking at individuals, we looked at societies? And this is the only study I'm aware of that has done this. In this study, the rate of Alzheimer's disease, the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease in 93 different countries was evaluated using data from the WHO. Each of these 93 countries was assessed for the mean number of languages spoken on average by people in that society. So you have countries where people are predominantly monolingual, predominantly bilingual, and so on. And these are calculated on the basis of the entire population. But it's complicated because countries have different levels of wealth and healthcare and education, all of that matters. And furthermore, Alzheimer's disease is a disease of aging. So you first of all have to live long enough to develop Alzheimer's disease. So this study managed to include all of these variables to look at the question about the relation between the number of languages spoken on average in the population and the societal incidence of Alzheimer's disease. Interesting question, very complicated, but the results are actually remarkably simple. Now, here's the results. This doesn't at all look simple, I know, but let me break it down for you. Along the x-axis is the mean number of languages spoken by the population. And on the y-axis is the incidence of Alzheimer's disease per 100,000 population. The data are broken down into 3 lines based on life expectancy in that country: low, medium, and high. Now, once we get beyond 2, there are very few countries that are involved, and they just produce noise. So I want you only to look at countries that are essentially monolingual or bilingual. And this is 90% of the sample. The 10% here, there's not enough data to make sense of. So first look at countries with a low life expectancy. That's the black line. Nobody gets Alzheimer's disease, and it doesn't matter how many languages you speak, nobody lives long enough to get Alzheimer's disease. Medium life expectancy is the red line. And I don't know why this hasn't been extended, it should start here. But what you need to see here is the difference between Alzheimer's incidence for monolingual countries or bilingual countries. But the biggest gap is for countries with high life expectancy, where people actually do get a lot of Alzheimer's disease because they live long enough. And here you see a very, very clear pattern between monolingual and bilingual countries, and an enormous difference in the incidence of Alzheimer's disease. So lower incidence for more bilingual countries. Finally, the fourth specific prediction from this graph comes from the very bottom. And it's this. It's somewhat counterintuitive, but if you look at this graph, it makes perfect sense. Following the diagnosis, after you pass this clinical threshold, the decline is steeper for high reserve individuals, in this case for bilinguals. And that's obvious because there's a common endpoint. Everybody ends up at the common endpoint. And if you postponed it and postponed it and postponed it, you're still going to get to that common endpoint. So the last bit of the journey is steeper. We did this, we looked at this issue by considering the conversion of mild cognitive impairment, which is typically considered to be pre-Alzheimer's disease, to Alzheimer's disease. And we know that conversion proceeds at a particular rate. So if the clinical symptoms are later and there's more neuropathology, that means bilinguals should convert from mild cognitive impairment to Alzheimer's in a shorter period of time than monolinguals. We matched patients in a clinic on age, education, diagnosis, cognitive levels, all sorts of things. And our question was, what was the interval between the diagnosis of MCI and the diagnosis of Alzheimer's? And these patients are matched as in much detail as we can. And what we found is the average conversion for monolinguals was 2.5 years, and for bilinguals, just under 2 years. Now you might say, oh, half a year, what's the big deal? It's a big deal. If someone you know and love is getting Alzheimer's disease, postponing it by a half year is a very big deal. And those are the brain data. And you could say, well, you know, they all get there anyway, but the bilinguals had more time with healthy living. So to summarize, we've shown that on this graph that defines all of the relations that determine the definition for cognitive reserve, bilinguals meet the definitional criteria for high reserve. They had better cognitive level and or brain structure in healthy aging. Their they had more neuropathology despite the same level of cognitive function. When cognitive impairment was clinically diagnosed, bilinguals had more pathology for the same level. And following the diagnosis, there was more rapid decline for bilinguals. So we could say that these 4 sets of findings meet the criteria to say bilinguals are high reserve relative to monolinguals who are low reserve. So why? What's going on here? So what we're looking at now is trying to figure out how those brain regions in the front of the brain, remember those attention mechanisms were in the front of the brain, how they protect the parts of the brain where cognitive impairment comes in the medial temporal lobe. So there's pathology, disease, decline inside the brain, but somehow regions in the front of the brain allow high reserve bilinguals to function at a higher level. And what we see is in the various approaches we use to studying these brains is that bilinguals have more efficient brains. Their brains are more resilient. They can push out more function on less fuel. They're more efficient. But this is just bilingualism. And I showed you at the beginning that there are a variety of ways that people use to build cognitive reserve and keep those lines apart. What are the implications of this for understanding bilingualism and dementia? I think the most important thing we have to understand is that the important thing about cognitive aging and cognitive reserve is that it has to be defined in terms of the relation between cognitive level and brain level. It isn't one or the other. People who maintain incredibly high cognitive function, but for whatever reason, their brain is also at a high level, a situation called brain reserve, that's not cognitive reserve. Cognitive reserve is when the relation between cognitive level and brain level separates. So we need information about brain structure and cognitive level. And cognitive level, because typically we only look at cognitive function. You don't wake up in the morning and go for your daily MRI brain scan. Cognitive reserve might conceal the presence of dementia. So if we're going to identify and adequately intervene in cognitive aging and pathological cognitive aging, we need sensitivity to all of the information and the relation between them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Dr. Makoni, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Bialystok. What I want to do in order to clarify my thinking, I want to move you into a slightly different context and ask similar questions to see what issues get clarified if I were to move you into if I were to situate you into a different context of situation. For example, how would such studies be carried out in context in which chronological aging is in itself problematic, where you are not very clear how old people are chronologically? How would I go about this? If the notion of chronological aging within this community that I'm in is not a reliable measure of aging, what else do I use as an alternative?
Cognitive, instead of precise chronological age.
Yes.
Well, it's an interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
So chronological age is only one of the variables.
Yes.
And of course, it's an important one.
Uh-huh.
How much would be lost if exact chronological age were
It's
not
not
available? I would
Uh-huh.
say some, but not a lot. I
Uh-huh.
don't, in older age, I don't think it makes a lot of difference. I
Uh-huh.
think that there's more variability among individuals in older age than perhaps even in childhood.
Mhm.
So I don't think it would cause enormous problems. I think it's experiences. So there's an incredibly interesting research group in Hyderabad, India, that studies all of this. And their population is completely different from mine. So they have people, they first of all, it's huge. Like they have, if I do a study with 40 people, they have 400. If I have 100, they have 1,000. It's, it's India. They have a lot of population. And the diversity is incredible. So they have people in their population, older adults with and without dementia, who have never been to school a day in their life,
Yes.
who may speak 3 different languages, who, I mean, everything is different, right?
Yes.
And still they find these exact patterns. The other thing they find, importantly, now this isn't an exact answer to your question, but they find more languages, more postponement of dementia, all that stuff. But the overall age of onset of dementia in their sample is substantially younger than it is in the West, substantially. So it's being postponed by the same factors, but people are showing these diseases at a significantly younger age. So I think you're raising an interesting question, and we don't really know the answer. Age matters doesn't seem to change the patterns of these effects, but it does move things around a little bit. And if you didn't have exact chronological age, I think you could still do a lot of this research.
When I was following your presentation, and I then tried to remind myself when we tried to do similar studies in South Africa, the problem we were faced with was one of formal literacy. It was not that we couldn't find the older bilinguals. The problem when we went to the African Black population was that the situation got confounded by the problems of literacy, right? It was not clear to...
Problem, I don't know what you're saying, the problems of...
No, the problem of whether the individuals were literate or not.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yes. So, for example, we could get all the individuals, but then some were not formally literate. They'd never been to school, right? And then some had gone to school. So my question is this: if you speculate about these different contexts, will the results of your studies be different if you were comparing bilinguals who were formally literate with bilinguals who had never been to school?
Okay, I can answer that. I don't have to speculate. Because they did this in the Hyderabad study.
Okay.
And the interesting result is that in the illiterate population, multilingual but illiterate, the gap between monolinguals and bilinguals was greater than it was in the literate population. So illiterate multilinguals showed a greater postponement of dementia symptoms than literate bilinguals did, which is fascinating. And I'm not sure why. You can make up reasons as well as I can, but that's what the data showed. There's a similar result. Now, this is the other result that's similar but doesn't include literacy, but does include education. So this is a study conducted in California, Spanish-English bilinguals in a dementia clinic, comparing the postponement of onset of Alzheimer's disease in monolingual versus bilingual Hispanic English bilinguals, broken down by education. So there was a small difference for highly educated Spanish-English bilinguals. There was a small postponement. For very low educated bilinguals compared to monolinguals, a much greater postponement. So it's like literacy itself is a factor. Just being literate is no, it's the other. The illiterates, bilingualism is compensating for something, even in literate populations. That's
Okay. So if I were to refocus this and say, and let me paint this scenario for you, that in most African contexts, the aging individuals may live in multi-generational households, right? They may be bilingual, they may be literate, but they live in multi-generational households. Does frequency, and I don't know whether you can talk about quality of interaction across generations, have an impact on all this? What role, I mean, what would be does it have any impact on this sort of, I know this is not a fair question to ask, because your context is different, but I'm trying to make sense of your studies by talking about a context that I know, right?
I think that's a wonderful question. I think that's an incredibly important question. I think it's a question that has not really shown up on the radar enough. We know that social interactions are hugely important. We know that people who are in familiar, supportive environments do better. And I think your question is incredibly important because you're describing a set of circumstances that are culturally determined that happen to be related to better outcomes. So I just think this is something someone should study. I completely agree. There are also cultural differences. So I'm going to tread into possibly dangerous territory here. So if anyone is offended, I apologize in advance. I'm a scientist, not a medical. A number of years ago, I was at a conference where all these issues were being discussed. And a young woman gave a fantastic talk. She had just gotten the job as head of the Alzheimer's Society for her region in the US. And she happens to be heritage Chinese. So she phoned her mother in China and said, hey, fantastic news. I got this amazing job. And her mother said, why would you want that job? Chinese people don't get Alzheimer's disease. So I spoke to her, what's this all about? And she came up, I mean, she had to make it up because Chinese people get Alzheimer's disease. Everybody gets Alzheimer's disease, right? So she said, well, in China, it's an embarrassment. So grandparents become old and peculiar, and the family just kind of covers it up and says, oh, grandpa, he's a little peculiar. A lot of, because there's been so much migration over the past couple of generations, people don't realize that their grandparent left back home actually has a disease. She came up with a bunch of post hoc things, but this was very salient. Her mother is convinced that this is a fact. So there are cultural factors not investigated. I think this has to expand to include the multiple ways that cultural practices, cultural attitudes, cultural concepts of family and so forth impact these ideas.
I'm embarrassed to say this, but I think I will. When I was in South Africa and I was working, that's how, when I first encountered your work. One of the earliest papers that I wrote with a friend of mine called Monica Ferreira was called "Do Africans Suffer from Alzheimer's Disease?" And now the question why that was an important question at that point was that what we did was methodologically we would sort of go and ask, inquire from different individuals or they suffer from Alzheimer's disease. They would reframe and tell us about particular diseases, but not Alzheimer's disease, because Alzheimer's disease was seen as stigmatized. So it was not one of the conditions that they would say grandmom or father or dad has, etc. So that's why we then ended up with this rhetorical question that said, do Africans suffer from Alzheimer's disease?
Yeah.
Because
It's
nobody
interesting, isn't it, that
Yes.
people would even ask this question.
Yes.
I find just the question to be interesting.
Mm,
Right? People don't say, do Africans or Chinese people or whatever suffer from measles, right?
And that's why what your work, why your work is interesting is when it implemented biological and anthropological approaches to Alzheimer's.
I'm sorry you're frozen. I can't hear anything. Is it just me? You've frozen.
No, it's not just.
Hi, Kim. Kim.
You're back now, Makoni. You can.
Oh, okay.
You can
yes.
repeat your question. That'll be helpful.
Oh, okay. Yes, I was saying that the issue which was coming up was, do Africans suffer from Alzheimer's disease? Even though the answer scientifically was yes, but the answer from a medical anthropological perspective was no, because they would frame Alzheimer's disease radically differently. Okay. I think I must stop and hand over to
Can I add
Byron.
one more point, though, to your
Oh, yeah,
question?
yes.
Remember on that country graph data that I showed,
Yes.
the main factor by far
Yes.
was life expectancy.
Yes.
So if you're talking about a country with a low life expectancy, indeed, there's very little Alzheimer's disease, and that would apply to many African countries.
Yeah, but what has happened in the African context now is when you factor out the number of people who have died from HIV, the African population is living much longer.
Okay.
Right. So why issues about gerontology and aging have become important in Africa is that once you have removed that group, they are now living much longer. And then the challenges that HIV had created is that the grandparents now needed to be cognitively intact to look after the grandchildren because there was this missing generation.
Interesting.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for this. Let me give over to Byron, and then thanks, Byron.
Thank you. Dr. Bialystok, there is a question about, could you clarify how bilinguals are defined in this research? Are these people who acquired 2 languages in childhood, or does the definition and research studies include people who learned a second language in later life? Thank you.
Right. It's messy. You can't put strict criteria. If you're only going to look at people who had 2 languages from home, from birth, you're dealing with a very small subset. And then they go on and they live their whole lives, because by the time they get into the studies I'm showing you, they're like 70 years old. So even people who were, bilingual from birth, that doesn't mean they were constantly bilingual for their whole 70 or 75 years. So you have to be a little bit loose. So we define it in these studies as people who have actively used 2 languages for most of their lives, certainly since the age of 20, which means they've been doing it for 50 years in most contexts. And you can't be more precise than that. People's life histories are far too complicated. The other thing we can't do with our population, some people say, yeah, but what was their L1? What was their L2? First language, second language. We can't do that either, because their first language can be anything. Then they go to school, and then their second language is something else. And then their fluency dominance shifts. So languages are fluid and dynamic, and their use and proficiency in the languages changes over time. So all we say for these older adult studies is the extent to which people have used more than one language for most of their lives in most contexts.
Thank you. Dr. Maffer has a question, and presumably the key factor in offsetting cognitive decline is active bilingualism, correct? Not merely passive knowledge of a second or third language?
Yeah, that's largely correct. We do find effects of passive bilingualism. We've done studies with young adults where even passive bilingualism shows impacts. So it is a thing, passive bilingualism. In these studies, we're only looking at active bilinguals. I think it would be a smaller effect, would be a messier effect. So we did not include passive bilinguals in these studies.
Thank you. Dr. Scott has a question about, can you share with us references to any key studies of this important subject in Heidelberg?
You know what I can do? I have a very short review paper that I will send to you. I'll send to Professor McConey and can share widely.
Okay.
And this little review paper, it's same structure as this talk. It has all the data, all the papers and stuff. It's a couple of years old, but it's basically the same. And I'm happy to send that to Professor McConey.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. And lastly, I kind of like have a personal question because I'm kind of interested in like what is dialect and what is language. So it might be interesting to look at it from like a cognitive standpoint. And I wonder if people who speak different dialects or registers such as legalese within the same language share the same benefit of bilingual
Largely,
speakers.
yes, right, largely, yes. So there, you know, these studies, and as you know, I could tell by the way you were smiling when you read the question, the difference between languages is sometimes smaller than the difference between dialects. So people have looked at different dialects and different languages, and it's essentially the same. In fact, now there's some recent studies using diglossia, which you can talk about as a kind of a dialect. So these have been done with Arab-speaking populations. So spoken Arabic, not only is different in every country that has Arabic as the national language, but it's completely different from written Arabic. So you can talk about these varieties of the same language. And again, it's all, you know, if you're monitoring two systems, this is what you get. So whether you call those systems languages or dialects or whatever, really makes less difference. Here,
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Dr. McConey.
Yeah, okay, let me continue my conversation while Ashraf, Desmond and company prepare their questions. If, for example, bilingualism enables us to some extent to retain some level of cognitive reserve, are there studies then that have looked into how older adults can learn a new language? Let's say you are being taught a new language in your 60s. And what would be the impact of such studies on the onset of Alzheimer's disease? If, for example, I realized that I wasn't bilingual, and then I come across your work and then say, oh, but let me go and try and learn another new language later in life, will that have a positive impact?
Okay, it's a great question. I have two answers.
Yes.
So the first answer is you should learn another language in older age, not because it's going to make you bilingual,
yes,
but because the process of learning a new language is hard. And anything that's hard for your brain is good for your brain.
Okay.
So going through this difficult, stimulating exercise of trying to learn a new language, that in itself is a cognitive reserve factor.
Mhm.
The second answer
Mhm.
is this. We did one study. I don't know of any other study. We did one
Yes.
silly little study. It's published. I can send it to you.
Okay. Sure.
Older monolingual adults.
Mhm.
And we gave them a huge pile of cognitive tests,
Yes.
largely based on these kinds of conflict tasks, like the Stroop task that I
Mhm.
described. So
Mhm.
they're all monolingual, they're all the same age, they're all matched. And then we divided them into 3 groups.
Mhm.
One group, we said, all right, go away, and for the next 16 weeks, every day for the next 16 weeks, you have to spend 30 minutes a day practicing these brain games. You know what I mean by brain games? They're advertised all over the place.
Mhm.
These puzzles, they're good for your brain, yada, yada, okay?
Mhm.
So we gave them this app for their smartphones.
Mhm.
They had to practice 30 minutes a day for 6 weeks, these brain games. Now, these brain games
Mhm.
are very similar to the tasks we gave them. Very
Mhm.
similar, right?
Mhm.
A second group, we said, okay, you go away for the next 16 weeks.
Mhm.
And for 30 minutes every day, you have to learn Spanish on this language learning app. It was
Mhm.
Duolingo.
Mhm.
So you have to play Duolingo every day for 6 weeks and do that. Now, learning Spanish has nothing to do with these
Mhm.
cognitive tasks.
Mhm.
And the third group, we said, too bad, you lose. You just come back in 6 weeks and we're going to test you again. All right, whatever. We might have gone on with the study, but that's exactly the COVID moment, okay? So nothing.
Oh, okay. Okay.
All right, so after 16 weeks, we tested them all again on those same cognitive tasks.
Mhm.
You want to guess what happened?
Mhm. The group that was still continuing to learn this language that we had created were performing much.
It was Spanish.
Yes, the group that was learning Spanish was performing much better.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. And they did almost as well as the group that had to spend 6 weeks doing brain training. So their scores improved significantly. The group that did nothing after 6 weeks, their scores were the same. But here's the thing. We also asked them, so how did you like this? You know, did you
Yes,
like
yes.
doing that? What did you think? And the people who were in the brain training group,
Mhm.
they hated it. They said, oh, it was so boring and repetitive. Hated it. I had to really force myself to do it every day. The Spanish group, they loved it.
Mhm.
So, and they got the same kind of benefit. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to postpone Alzheimer's disease.
Yes, yes,
I'm
yes.
saying that using your brain in stimulating, engaging ways has measurable benefits.
So at an institutional or political level, what you are saying is that people should not retire then, because when they retire, they may cease using their brain at the same level of activity as they were doing prior to that.
I think that's I mean, you hear this too, right? People retire and then terrible things start happening.
Good. Right. Let me hand over to Byron and ask Desmond, do you have any questions that you want to ask?
Thank you, Makoni, and thank you, Professor, for this interesting presentation. I don't know that I necessarily have the question in the traditional sense of a question, but I have a wonder while I was listening to you talk. For clarification, because this didn't seem to be clear to me, could you give a sense of the end for the projects that you were describing here?
The number of participants, well,
Participants, yes.
It varies widely. I mean, there's no single answer. There's just no single answer to.
Could you give a sense of what that looks like? I know you had made a comment about India, compared to other contexts, and I just wondered what that. Are we talking about the hundreds or thousands?
But I can't, because if it's a study where we actually test people in person individually using measures, then it'll be 30, 40, and then in the 2021 study, it was 100. If it's a study where we're using clinical records from a hospital, it can be 500. If it's a study using brain scans, it's more likely to be 30 or 40. So, there's no single answer to that question.
Yeah. Well, I was just asking because I was wondering about the very first question about, how and when people learn, additional languages, or even the question about active or passive bilingualism. But I think you do comment on this extensively about the range of factors that might be at play here in trying to understand what is going on neurologically. And it makes me wonder if when one begins to poke at those factors and thinking about, the use of language in different domains for writing or speaking or just understanding or reading and so forth. If one were to begin to poke at all of that, does it raise enough question for one to say, depending on the number of participants in this study, that we don't have enough evidence yet to be able to draw causal explanations or to reach some firm conclusions, and perhaps seek to pull those other factors, or as many of those other factors, into the research design to improve confidence in what we're finding. I think that was just sort of my reflection, but I don't know if this forms a question really.
No, you're raising important points. I mean, there's no doubt that all of these things that you are raising matter very much. So the question is, how do you deal with it? Because you're right, it all matters. It matters how old you were and what the language was and where you use it and how proficient, it all matters. But you can't investigate it all at once. Now, first I can say that I have strong confidence in all of the results I showed you today, because I know how we control for those, what we might call nuisance factors. So when I say in this study we found that, I know that it is reliable for the population defined as I do. What the research is now doing is taking all of these things in more detail and saying, what is the effect of the age of first exposure? Let's study that. What is the effect of the context in which the language is used? For example, is it a context in which the other people in the interaction also speak those other languages? Because that determines how your brain selects which language you're going to be using. Is it a context in which you're the only one who speaks this language, you better not make a mistake? That matters too. How much do you switch between languages? So all of these things matter, and they are now being studied. So the research is proceeding, I think, in the way that you're suggesting these other questions still require. We need to know much more about these individual differences. I just had a thought. If I'm able, I mentioned this paper that has the references and is similar. I think I can put it on the chat if I think I can. I'm going to put it on the chat. Hold on, let me see if I'm not very good at this.
I think Kim Hansen has already put it on the chat.
Oh, really? Because I just did. I think I did it.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Okay. I'm proud of myself.
Okay, right. Okay, Mamani or Will, do you have any questions that you want to pose? Oh, Ashraf.
Prof, we have a question from Anissa.
Okay, Anissa, jump in, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Bialystok, for this most comprehensive treatment of a very complex issue. I have one little question here. I'd like you to solve this problem for me. Am I right in understanding that you said that in bilingualism, the brain does not confuse the two languages, they stay separate?
Not exactly. The brain doesn't confuse the two languages, but the languages do not stay separate.
Right.
That's the central mystery.
Right. And I'm asking this question because very recently, one of my neighbors who's Swedish and bilingual went to pick her family up at Inverness Airport. And while she was speaking to them in Swedish, she went into the Swedish driving mode and began to drive on the wrong side. And I wonder what was happening to her brain at that time. So I thought you might be able to.
Yeah, habits die hard, right? We habits. We're
Right.
driven by habits. How many examples can you think of where, so I think those sorts of, really automatic motor skills that we learn and then we have to somehow do a different way. It's hard to override them, but it's not the same process. It's not exactly the same phenomenon, I would say.
Right, thank you.
Cecile, do you have any comments that you want to make?
Ashraf has his hands raised.
Okay, yeah.
Ashraf has a question. Thanks, Ashraf.
Thank you so much. My question builds on Anisa's question. Your statement that the two languages stay, the brain doesn't confuse the two languages, but the two languages do not remain separate is really vague for me to understand. Because it seems to me as if you're saying the two languages are neurolinguistically isolated, but interactionally they're not. In other words, it seems to me as if you're saying the two languages are wired differently in the brain, however, in the interaction they are not. Is that the case? Are you saying that?
Well, yeah, it's a hard problem. So first of all, I have no opinion on where they're stored in the brain. It doesn't matter to me. They can be stored in the same neuronal tissue or in different neuronal tissue. It doesn't really matter. What we know for sure, and the evidence is phenomenally overwhelming, is that if a bilingual speaker is actively engaged in using one of their languages, the other one is active and interferes. We know this for sure. We know, for example, simple things like name pictures in one of your languages or read words in one of your languages. If the name of that word shares features with the word in the other language that you've been told not to activate, it's faster to name. If it doesn't, it's slower to name. I mean, there's all of these simple little things that you do that show both languages are active. Here's a wild experiment that I think is one of the best in the field. As I said, there's, the mountain of evidence showing both languages are active is absolutely overwhelming. But here's one that I find really intriguing. This is in Bangor, Wales. It's an English-speaking university. All the classes are in English. Now, there's Welsh out on the streets, but it's an English-speaking university. And it has a lot of foreign students. So here's an experiment where Chinese students whose first language is China were brought into the lab to do a psycholinguistics experiment. They were not told they were there because they speak Chinese. The experiment is in English, only English. That's all it is. So they sit down and the researcher says, thank you very much for coming in. We have a really simple experiment. We're going to show you pairs of words in English, of course. They don't even say that. It's obvious it's going to be in English. We're going to show you pairs of words in English. And your job is to say if the two words are semantically related or not. That's all. Just say two pairs of words, bread, butter, okay, table, chair, car, dragon. Just are they semantically related or not? Thank you very much. You've been a great help. Goodbye. And while they did this simple task, the electrical activity in their brain was recorded. The EEG was recorded. What the subjects did not know is for half of those pairs of words, half of them that were related, like chair, table, and half of them that were not related, like car, dragon. In each case, half of the words, if you were to translate those words and write them in Chinese, a crazy thing to even think about doing, but if you were to translate those words and write them in Chinese, half of them would share a Chinese character and half of them would not. Now, what could be more irrelevant? Nobody told them this experiment had anything to do with Chinese. They're certainly not supposed to be translating into Chinese, let alone thinking of how these words would be written in Chinese. But guess what? It matters. And if the two words, whether or not they shared any meaning in English, if they shared a Chinese character in their written form, they elicited different brain waves and they were faster to respond to. Why were these participants even thinking about how to write these words in Chinese? Because you can't help it. Because both languages are active and your brain is just firing on all the associations. So there is no controversy actually in the field that both languages are active. Now, where are they stored in the brain? I don't know, it doesn't really matter. What we know is that they're active, but bilingual speakers don't get confused. So something must be going on to direct bilingual speakers in the milliseconds of language production to select appropriately.
That's very interesting. Thanks for the response. For us, for some, maybe because it doesn't matter here because the target or the end or the objective of the study is different. But for some people, I'm just going to cite the case of diglossia. And Michael Scott raised 2 or 3 questions about diglossia in your context. But there's a study by 2 neuro-linguists. I can even mention the paper in the chat. The argument is that they said in the case of diglossia, the vernacular and the standard are wired, neuro-linguistic speaking, they're wired differently in the brain. They're built into the brain differently, and thus there are 2 different languages. Standard Arabic is a foreign language. This, of course, has an effect on how Standard Arabic is viewed from the perspective of the neuro-linguistics in relation to the vernacular. On one hand, and this view, the scientific view, differs from the folk linguistic view on the street. Because on the street, people do not view Standard Arabic as a foreign language. Our Standard Arabic and the vernacular are one single language. While neuro-linguistically, they're seen as 2 different languages. See the point?
Well, yeah, but I don't know what you're asking. I already used that example. So Standard Arabic is written, spoken Arabic is not written. So one is a written language, one isn't. Written languages are going to have different neuronal connections than non-written languages. So I'm not really sure what you're saying beyond what I think I've already said.
Well, what they are saying is that, from a neuro-linguistic point of view, there are two different varieties, two different languages,
Yes,
in
I
the brain.
agree.
While on the street, people on the street, we don't view them as two different. But we view them as one, culturally speaking, we view them as one language.
Okay. Well, fine. I mean, people can think what they want, but I'm not really sure where we're going with this.
It's
People
about
don't know,
bilingualism. It's about bilingualism. Now it's different. We have different understanding of bilingualism from a neuro-linguistic perspective and from a folk linguistic perspective. See the point?
I'm sorry, I don't see the point. I maybe somebody can explain, but I don't really understand. I've already said that diglossia is an example of two different systems, and that it should be the same as two different languages or two different dialects.
But that's Ellen, that's rejected. We have rejected that hypothesis. In a recent study, me and Dr. Yasser Suleiman, we destroyed that hypothesis.
Okay.
Using a folk linguistic perspective. That's my point.
All right, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Marconi, would you mind to providing us a concluding statement? Professor Marconi, you're muted.
Thanks. Let's thank Professor Ellen Bialystok and for the work that she has done in her career in this important area. And I think, as they say, that the interesting thing about aging is that we all age unless we are cowards and we die younger. So the challenges that she's posing, I think, are real. So what would be interesting in a way, I think, is to get and to read more about the Hyderabad studies in light of what Ellen Bialystok was talking about. Let's thank Elaine first. And then secondly, let me give over to Kim and Vishna to try and tell us who is coming next week.